Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of dense, fascinating source material, break it down, and deliver the absolute essentials directly.
Today, we are undertaking a deep exploration of Charles Dickens. He's a man who, perhaps more than any other figure, really defined the moral landscape of the Victorian age.
He really did. He was a humanitarian, a master of both comedy and tragedy, but also, and this is the interesting part, a figure whose personal life was just riddled with contradictions.
And breathtaking scandal, really.
Yes, exactly. So our mission today is to try and connect those two seemingly separate worlds. We want to understand how the profound trauma of his childhood became this intense engine for his magnificent social critique.
Right, and how the man who wrote these heartwarming tales of Christmas charity could, at the same time, be, as some of his contemporaries accused him, a moral hypocrite in his own home.
We've got an incredible stack of biographical accounts, literary critiques, and historical documents to guide us through this.
We really do. We're aiming to go beyond that sort of jolly, bearded image of the novelist that everyone knows and really examine the complex, often darkly driven man he truly was. A man who turned his greatest personal shames into these global literary triumphs.
Okay, let's get into it. And we're going to start not at his birth, but at a moment of sheer, terrifying crisis in the final years of his life. It's a moment that just shows Dickens's obsessive focus on his craft, even when he's facing imminent death. This is June 985.
It's a scene that could be ripped right out of one of his own dramatic novels. And Dickens was, well, literally in the middle of it.
So set the scene for us.
Okay, so a steam train, heavily laden with passengers, is traveling at speed through the Kent countryside near a village called Staplehurst, heading towards London.
And then suddenly just
Catastrophe.
total catastrophe. It's down to an egregious error workman had mistakenly removed a section of track on a viaduct. They thought no trains were due.
And so the passenger carriages just derail violently, plummeting into the dry riverbed of the river bilge below. It was a horrific accident. It killed 10 people instantly.
And Dickens is on this train.
Right in the thick of it. Amidst all the wreckage, a man in his mid-50s traveling in the first-class carriage manages to scramble out. He's physically unharmed, but, deeply shaken.
And he immediately starts helping people.
He does. He dedicates himself to helping the injured and the dying. He's administering brandy, fetching water, comforting the victims. He's acting as a true first responder with this astonishing calmness under fire.
But here's the detail. This is the critical, defining detail that I think truly captures Dickens the artist and the workaholic. After the immediate danger had passed and the initial rescue efforts were underway, he calmly walked back toward the smashed, wrecked carriage.
Which is just, terrifying to even think about doing.
Right. And he was focused on one thing. He wasn't looking for his hat or his money or, anything for his own personal comfort or survival.
He went back solely to retrieve the handwritten manuscript of his current novel, Our Mutual Friend.
Just think about that level of professional dedication and, frankly, obsession.
It's incredible.
You have just survived a mass casualty event that nearly killed you, yet your absolute priority is the physical continuation of your narrative. It's an act that just speaks volumes about the consuming fire of his ambition and his fear of losing his work.
And poignantly, Our Mutual Friend would prove to be the last full novel he ever completed. So that driven man, haunted by work and trauma, that was Charles Dickens, the most famous novelist of the age.
That moment really does provide the perfect lens to view his life through, doesn't it? This intense moral concern, but combined with an almost manic dedication to productivity and, self-preservation.
Exactly.
So we understand the destination, a man defined by tireless work and contradiction. Now let's go back to the origins, because to truly understand the relentless social critic, you have to understand the profound trauma of the 12-year-old boy.
Dickens was born on February 7th, 1812, in Portsmouth, Hampshire. And his parents, John and Elizabeth, were trying desperately to maintain this appearance of middle-class respect.
And this struggle, this constant fear of just falling through the social floorboards, that was central to his early life, wasn't it?
Absolutely. His father, John Dickens, worked as a clerk in the Navy Pay Office. And the crucial thing about John is that he was a man who preferred fantasy to financial reality.
He considered himself a man of culture, I believe. He acquired a pretty substantial library of classics like Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, The Arabian Nights, and young Charles just devoured all of them.
He did. So he was raised on these great stories of adventure and refinement and heroism. But this veneer of culture was built entirely on credit. John Dickens had a ruinous, chronic habit of living wildly beyond his means.
Always running up bills, constantly sliding further into inescapable debt.
And this financial instability, that was the toxic inheritance that Charles received from him.
His mother, Elizabeth Barrow, she played a really interesting role. She came from a cultured, if slightly impoverished family. And critically, her brothers were writers and journalists.
Yes, which gave Charles this early exposure to the potential and excitement of a literary life that wasn't, tied to boring legal firms or Navy pay office.
Their early life, particularly in Chatham, Kent, that was a period of relative happiness, wasn't it? A bit of innocence.
It was. Charles was taught to read by his mother, and he loved performing. He'd sing comic songs with his elder sister, Fanny, who was clearly musically gifted. She went on to become a professional musician.
And he was intellectually precocious, I read. He wrote a little tragic play at age 8.
He did. And it was during this relatively stable time that the seeds of his lifelong ambition were planted. It's something we refer to as the prophecy of Gad's Hill, which happened around 1821.
Ah, yes. He was 9 years old, walking with his father, and John Dickens pointed out this impressive brick mansion, Gad's Hill, on the road near Rochester.
A place famous because Shakespeare had immortalized it in Henry IV, Part 1. So it had this literary cachet.
And it was this visible symbol of entrenched wealth and permanence, something completely unattainable to a Navy pay office clerk's son.
Exactly. And Charles looked up at it and declared that he would like to live in a house like that someday.
And his father's reply was the absolute core of the Victorian self-help.
It was. He said that he could do so if he worked hard enough. It became this powerful, lifelong ambition for him, representing the stability and status he had never known.
But before the dream could be realized, the nightmare began.
It did. By 1822, the family had moved to London, specifically to Camden Town. And within a year, the whole pretense of prosperity just collapsed entirely.
And here's a detail that must have been incredibly Charles, and it fueled this lasting sense of personal. While the family debt was mounting, his sister Fanny was accepted into the prestigious Royal Academy of Music. That demanded an expensive tuition fee of 38 guineas a year.
So while she's pursuing this formal, prestigious education in the arts, Charles felt his own schooling was being completely neglected. He saw his sister moving upward socially while he was being dragged down.
This feeling of being overlooked and sacrificed for a sibling's status, it really fuels a powerful resentment, which we see channeled into so many of his protagonists' struggles against neglect.
The family's situation was so desperate that Elizabeth Dickens tried this last-ditch effort to solve their problem by setting up a school in the autumn of 1823.
And the humiliation of that was intense. Charles was forced to help advertise the school, handing out flyers, putting up notices around the neighborhood.
And the result, total failure.
Right.
Not a single student registered. The whole scheme was this public failure that just underscored their absolute precarity and the depth of their desperation.
That public humiliation was immediately followed by the ultimate shame. In February 1824, the inevitable happened.
John Dickens was arrested for non-payment of debt and sent to Marshalsea Debtors' Prison in Southwark.
And this event was the singular defining trauma of Charles Dickens' life, a psychological scar that just never healed.
Never. He was 12 years old, and he was forced to become the man of the family, taking possessions, piece by piece, the furniture, the clothes, and most painfully of all, his entire collection of books, to the pawnbroker to raise a few shillings.
The loss of the books, the source of his imaginative comfort and his education, and it was all due to the fecklessness of his father.
It created this lifelong rage against insolvency and social injustice, but the humiliation was really only just beginning.
Right. And then came the forced labor, the deepest, most secret humiliation of his life. He was sent to work at Warren's blacking warehouse near Charing Cross,
earning a pitiful 6 shillings a week, placing lids on pots of shoe polish and labeling them.
This wasn't just physical labor, it was a profound psychological degradation for a sensitive, intelligent, imaginative boy.
He was working alongside rough, uneducated boys in these dire conditions with the overwhelming stench of chemicals. He later confessed he felt utterly abandoned, believing his own promise and genius were being extinguished while his sister continued her artistic ascent.
He lodged near the prison so he could visit his parents, as his mother had joined his father in Marshalsea. And this detail is so crucial because it speaks to the source of his profound sense of betrayal.
Yes, he resented, above all, that his mother seemed content to leave him there, working, while the family unit was superficially restored inside the prison walls.
He internalized this shame so deeply that he kept the blacking warehouse experience almost entirely secret until he finally confided the details to his biographer, John Forster, decades later.
And the irony is, this traumatic environment supplied him with some of his greatest characters and themes. The kindness shown by the older boys, including a lad named Bob Fagin, gave him the name for the criminal mastermind in Oliver Twist.
So the blacking warehouse experience wasn't just some temporary inconvenience. It was the psychological wound that fueled his entire...
He feared poverty, he feared debt, and he feared the institutional cruelty that treated a child's education and promise as completely disposable.
The brief respite finally came in May 1824, when his paternal grandmother died and left John Dickens £400.
Right. And that was enough to secure his discharge from Marshall.
But Charles continued at the blacking factory farm, a situation he deeply resented compared to Fanny's success. When his father was finally pensioned off, Charles was allowed to quit.
And John Dickens agreed to send him to Wellington House Academy for a couple. He studied Latin, math, and English, and importantly, he indulged his dramatic side by staging theatrical performances and helping assemble a rudimentary newspaper.
But that financial instability was their constant companion.
Always. By spring 1827, soon after his 15th birthday, he was forced to leave school because his father couldn't afford the fees again. So he turned to the legal world, working as a clerk at various law firms like Ellis and Black.
This period was absolutely critical because it gave him this first-hand, detailed insight into the mechanics of the legal profession.
He saw the piles of confusing, convoluted documents, the endless delays.
And he confirmed his view, which would become the core theme in Bleak House, that lawyers intentionally complicated matters and protracted legal solely to enrich themselves at the expense of justice poor.
He saw the legal system as a slow, grinding, predatory engine, not a protective.
So by the time he was 16, Dickens had experienced financial ruin, institutional degradation, and the predatory nature of the law. He had this deep well of pain, shame, and rage.
And the world was about to hear about it.
Okay, so the next phase is this rapid transformation of Charles Dickens, the traumatized law clerk, into Boz, the literary sensation.
And this change was largely inspired by his father, John Dickens, who had found a new life as a parliamentary reporter.
Right. John Dickens, ever the dramatist, knew how to spin a good yarn, and Charles quickly realized that reporting offered the excitement and mobility that the stagnant law offices lacked.
So he left the law offices, taught himself shorthand, which was a feat of immense dedication required to capture rapid-fire speeches, and became a court reporter in 1829.
The mastery of shorthand, that was his ticket to upward mobility, wasn't it?
It absolutely was. It allowed him to transcribe rapid speeches and debates accurately, making him a highly valued commodity. By early 1832, he was a freelance parliamentary reporter for the Mirror of Parliament, covering history in the making.
He was covering some of the most crucial political events of the era, notably the debates surrounding the Reform Act of 1832,
which aimed to expand the voter franchise to more of the middle class and address the deeply unequal representation in Parliament.
Now, Dickens was inherently a liberal reformer. He supported expanding rights, but our sources note he was deeply unimpressed by the self-important speeches and the performative politics.
He felt that these politicians were willfully ignoring the crushing poverty and penury right outside the House of Commons doors in London. His skepticism of institutions, political or legal, was confirmed yet again.
And here's where it gets really interesting on the personal front, which fueled his early writing. While he was climbing the ranks, he fell passionately in love.
In May 1830, with the 20-year-old Maria Beadnell, the daughter of a prosperous city banker.
A classic Dickensian doomed relationship, driven entirely by class.
Entirely. Maria's parents looked at Charles, the aspiring, debt-tinged reporter with no guaranteed future, and found him entirely unacceptable as a suitor. He was rejected entirely in February 1833, after she returned from a year in Paris.
The heartbreak was profound, and it marked his first experience with love, complicated and ultimately blocked status.
And this painful experience of infatuation with an unattainable, idealized woman directly inspired the character Doris Spendle, the charming but impractical young wife in David Copperfield.
So fueled by ambition and maybe the pain of rejection, he turned to writing these short, observational sketch British society.
Impressionistic pieces capturing the humor and oddity of London life. His first published sketch, A Dinner at Popular Walk, appeared anonymously in the monthly magazine in December 1833.
And he was instantly hooked on the power of the printed word. By August 1834, we get the birth of the famous name, Boz.
It's a really endearing origin story. It shows his sense of humor. The name was inspired by the nickname Moses, which he gave his younger brother, Augustus.
And Charles, suffering from one of his frequent colds, had trouble pronouncing the name, and it came out as Boz.
Exactly. It just stuck because it sounded quirky and memorable.
But despite these literary steps, he still needed a guaranteed income. So he secured a permanent job at the Morning Chronicle in August 1834 and began writing his Boz sketches for its sister paper, the Evening Chronicle,
which was edited by a man named George Hogarth.
And it was through this connection that he met Catherine Hogarth, George's 19-year-old daughter.
And Dickens was a whirlwind. He was magnetic. Within months of their meeting, despite his lack of guaranteed wealth, they were engaged. They married on April 2nd, 1836, just as his career was absolutely exploding.
The 2 volumes of sketches by Boz were published that year. George Hogarth praised him as a close and acute observer.
And this momentum led directly to the opportunity that changed everything, cementing his status not just as a reporter, but as an author. Chapman and Hall approached,
offering him £14 per month to write accompanying text for a series of monthly sporting sketches illustrated by the famous Robert Seymour. This was the genesis of the Pickwick Paper.
But the critical point here is that the work was initially struggling. The price was too high for the masses, and the original, rather stiff sporting concept just wasn't connecting with people.
If he had failed then, the history of English literature would found.
It would. But Dickens, ever the master of invention, saved the series. For the fourth installment, he introduced the iconic Cockney servant, Sam Weller.
Full of street wit, memorable sayings, and this irresistible humor that just cut through all the formality.
And Sam Weller transformed the Pickwick Papers overnight. Sales soared, turning the series into a genuine sensation enjoyed by everyone, from the wealthy club member to the poorest Londoner reading it out loud in the street.
Dickens's career was set on an upward trajectory from which it never truly departed.
And by 1837, the dual nature of his writing was already so evident. He was still writing the comedic final installments of Pickwick, while simultaneously beginning the grim, realist portrayal of child exploitation in his next project, Oliver Twist.
That blend of humor and profound social darkness would define his entire career.
This era, the late 1830s through the 1840s, this is where Dickens truly solidifies his identity as a literary master and, crucially, as a social campaigner.
He and Catherine moved to a large house on Doughty Street, which is now the Charles Dickens, and over time they would have 10 children.
It was during this intensely creative period that he experienced a devastating personal loss that profoundly impacted his emotional life.
You're talking about Catherine's younger sister, Mary Hogarth.
Yes, a beautiful and charming 17. She had moved in to help the young family, and Dickens absolutely adored her. She was his ideal companion, an early reader of his draft.
And in May 1837, after a night at the theater, Mary suddenly collapsed and died in his arms.
Dickens was utterly distraught. He plunged into a state of grief so severe that he couldn't write for 2 months. He was forced to postpone the next installments of both the Pickwick Papers and Oliver Twist.
A highly risky move, considering his monthly income depended entirely on those installments.
That measure of emotional impact is vital. Some biographers argue that Mary became enshrined in his memory as the idealized, pure woman, a sort of spiritual twin that Catherine could never be. She became the model for many of the innocent, sometimes saintly, young women who suffer or die in his later work.
And what's fascinating is how he managed that grief alongside his massive workload. He leaned heavily on his close and essential friendship with the literary critic John
Forster became his emotional lifeline, his sounding board for artistic ideas, and, critically, his indispensable business.
He was the practical genius Dickens needed.
Absolutely. He secured vital business terms, ensuring that the copyright on Dickens's novels would revert to him after 3 years. This crucial detail gave Dickens long-term financial stability and independence, preventing him from ever suffering the debt trap that had ruined his father.
And the masterpieces just kept coming, each one a strategic campaign against a social. Nicholas Nickleby, serialized between 1838 and 1839, focused its satirical rage on the draconian, neglectful conditions in cheap Yorkshire boarding.
And then the novel rooted most deeply in his painful memory, Oliver Twist. Published in book form in 1839, it's a dark satire of the Victorian workhouse system and the criminal underworld.
He pulls directly from his childhood shame, creating the criminal mastermind Fagin and the brutal murderer Bill Sykes, using real-life figures.
And the level of gritty realism was just groundbreaking. He wasn't just sentimentalizing poverty. He was exposing the system that forced children into the hands of criminals.
The execution of Fagin, the accidental hanging of Sykes after he murders Nancy, these were visceral, dramatic scenes that captivated his vast.
From the poorest street reader to Queen Victoria herself, who found the book excessively interesting.
That audience breadth speaks volume. But Dickens, ever restless and suffering from his respiratory, frequently had to leave smog-choked London.
Right, moving to quieter villages like Petersham and Broadstairs in Kent for his health. He was a workaholic, operating constantly at high stress.
In 1842, seeking both a break and a commercial opportunity, he took a year-long sabbatical, touring the United States with Cat. He arrived a celebrity.
He did. He met key cultural figures like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, Washington Irving, and even Edgar Allan Poe, who wrote to him saying he was Dickens's greatest admirer.
But the American misadventure, as it's often called, quickly got complicated.
Yes, because of his dual goals. He was campaigning vigorously for international copyright protection, incensed that American publishers were pirating his books without paying him proper narration.
And his second goal was his strong liberal, his deep opposition to the inhumanity which he witnessed firsthand in places.
His anti-slavery stance was uncompromised. It challenged the entire Southern social structure.
So he published his recollections in American Notes in 1842. And while it sold well in England, his strong opposition to slavery and his candid, often caustic criticism of American manners, the spitting, The vulgarity he perceived led to a sharp decline in his popularity in large.
He was seen as an arrogant, judgmental foreigner.
And he further channeled that contempt into his next novel, Martin Chuzzlewit, in 1843, which featured satirical portrayals of grasping, self-interested.
And here's the interesting financial outcome. Chuzzlewit flopped commercially. It sold only about 20,000 copies against a peak of 100,000 for previous works.
A rare event for Dickens. This commercial stumble forced him to quickly devise a new popular venture.
And that desperation, that need to correct a financial misstep, ironically led to what may be his single greatest cultural legacy.
A Christmas.
Exactly. Conceived in October 1843, published just before Christmas. It was a short book focused on mass appeal and moral sense.
The impact was immediate and lasting. The story of Ebenezer Scrooge's ghostly journey and his redemption, charity, and good cheer not only sold out instantly, but profoundly in modern Western Christmas.
It really did, popularizing the idea of a secular, benevolent Christmas celebration.
Yet, here's the unexpected financial. It didn't fully solve his immediate money problem.
No, because Dickens was so committed to making it a beautiful gift book that he insisted on expensive production costs, high-quality paper, intricate binding, color illustration. These costs ate so severely into the profits that he earned significantly less than he had hoped for from that first edition.
What's fascinating here is that despite the mixed financial return, his deep commitment to hands-on philanthropy was undeniable. He partnered with Angela Burdett Coutts, the heiress of Coutts Bank, to support ragged schools for impoverished children.
And the ultimate expression of his applied social mission was Urania Cottage, which he established and personally managed starting in 1847. This was a shelter for homeless women, often those who had fallen into prostitution.
He provided clothing, food, and essential education for nearly a decade, trying to prepare them for a new life.
This wasn't just check-writing philanthropy. It was intensive, demanding personal work that demonstrated a true, applied commitment to social reform. He was leading by example, attempting to enact the benevolence he wrote about.
He even tried to influence politics directly again, launching the Daily News in 1846, a liberal newspaper. He edited it briefly.
And in a fantastic piece of family loyalty, or potentially folly, he hired his financially responsible father as the manager of reporters and his father-in-law, George Hogarth, as the music critic.
Incredible. By the end of this decade, he produced what he considered his personal favorite and one of his most complex.
David Copperfield. Serialized between 1849 and 1850, it was a semi-autobiographical triumph told in the first person.
This novel is the clearest reflection of his own painful childhood and his unresolved feelings about his family, the characters of Mr. and Mrs. Micawber.
The kindly, hopelessly irresponsible landlord and landlady who are constantly waiting for something to turn up and are eventually sent to debtor's prison.
They're transparently based on John and Elizabeth.
Without a doubt. The story charts David's journey through loss, labor, which is a disguised nod to the Blacking Warehouse experience infatuation with the doomed Dora Spenlow, and finally, finding true, lasting love with the steady, constant Agnes Wickfield.
It became his best-known novel and a massive financial success, cementing his status not just as a popular writer, but as a wealthy, secure literary figure entering his late 30s.
He had achieved the prosperity and stability that his own childhood so profoundly lacked.
But professional security did not translate to personal stability. As we move into the 1850s, Dickens enters a phase of literary maturity that is shadowed by profound personal crisis, professional turmoil, and immense loss.
He launched a new, successful periodical, Household Words, in 1850. It was dedicated entirely to social improvement, covering public health, education, and housing reform. Elizabeth Gaskell became a frequent, respected contributor.
But this period also brought immense personal loss that piled stress onto his already heavy work. In 1851, his father, John, died.
And despite all the trouble and shame John had caused, Charles mourned him deeply. Then, just 2 weeks later, his 9-month-old daughter, Dora, died suddenly, compounding his anguish.
Dealing with this grief and turmoil, he turned his focus back to his greatest, the legal.
Which brings us to Bleak House, serialized between 1852 and 1853. It is his masterful, sprawling satire on the law he detested.
And the central narrative device is the Chancery case of Jarndyce versus Jarndyce.
Right. To understand the depth of his critique, you have to understand the Court of Chancery. This was the court responsible for settling estates and trusts, and it was notorious for relying on ancient precedent and slow, laborious proceedings.
The structural flaw that Dickens exposed was that Chancery law allowed lawyers and court officials to charge fees and drag the case out year after year, sometimes for generations, without any resolution.
The legal system was designed to perpetuate its own existence. The case of Jarndyce versus Jarndyce runs for decades, with multiple hopeful claimants, until the legal costs literally absorbed the entire estate. Nobody wins but the lawyers.
It was a vicious, powerful demonstration of how bureaucracy could actively perpetuate misery, and the novel was a phenomenal phenomenal success, wasn't it? Made him £11,000.
A huge sum. Then came Hard Times in 1854, an unusually short novel, serialized in household words specifically to boost its circulation.
Set in the fictional, smoke-choked industrial town of Coketown, based on Preston, it's a furious critique of industrialization and its underlying philosophy.
Specifically, he was attacking utilitarianism, the philosophy of the greatest good for the greatest number, which often boiled down to formulaic, measurable facts over imagination and human emotion.
And this cold calculation is embodied by the draconian schoolteacher, Mr. Gradgrind,
who demands only fact, fact, fact from his student. Gradgrind's educational philosophy is soul-crushing and causes his own children to rebel against their emotional repression.
And the foil to this rigid worldview is Cecilia Jupe, the circus girl, who represents creativity, amusement, and the essential need for imagination and compassion that the utilitarian mind lacks.
While Dickens was busy dismantling the moral infrastructure of Victorian England in his fiction, his own domestic system was collapsing entirely.
His relationship with Catherine, the mother of his 10 children, was severely deteriorating throughout
The accounts are consistent. Dickens was a man of manic energy. He was restless, enjoying these long, intense walks, sometimes 15 or 20 miles a day, and constant theatrical adventure.
Catherine was homebound, exhausted by childbearing, and preferred stability.
He began to find them fundamentally incompatible. He argued that they lacked spiritual and intellectual alignment, and as a famous author, Dickens had no shortage of female admirers, and his public flirting caused Catherine justifiable jealousy and tension.
This tension inspired Little Dorrit, serialized from 1855 to 1857, where he returns yet again to the site of his deepest childhood trauma, Marshalsea debtor's prison.
The heroine, Amy Dorrit, is the daughter of a debt prisoner, and the entire novel orbits themes of debt, financial fortune, and the prison of social status.
And in 1856, he finally fulfilled his lifelong ambition. He bought the Gads Hill mansion for £1,700, the very house his father had pointed out decades before.
But moving into the symbol of ultimate success coincided with the major destructive turning point in his life.
The fateful introduction of Ellen Ternan.
In 1857, Dickens, then 45, met the 18-year-old actress, nicknamed Nellie, while both were acting in Wilkie Collins' play, The Frozen.
And Dickens became instantly, intensely obsessed with making her his mistress. He began sleeping separately with Catherine.
The emotional turmoil was so great it temporarily hindered his ability to write, forcing him to rely more heavily on lucrative paid public readings to maintain his income.
By mid-1858, the situation was untenable and the separation became official. Catherine moved in with her elderly parent.
The eldest son, Charles, notably sided with his mother, but Dickens's loyal, longtime sister-in-law, Georgina Hogarth, stood by him and moved to Gads Hill.
The rumors surrounding the separation of an affair with a young actress, or even with Georgina, forced Dickens, the self-appointed moral compass of England, to act.
He wrote a deeply damaging, self-justifying letter, which he first published in the New York Tribune, and then permitted to be reprinted in major English papers, including The Times.
The content of this letter is shocking in its cruelty and audacity.
It is. He claimed the marriage had been unhappy for many years and asserted that Catherine was mentally ill and incapable of managing the household, while simultaneously denying an affair without ever naming Ellen Ternan.
It was an act of profound public callousness against the mother of his 10 children, designed purely to protect his public moral brand.
And the consequences were immense. His social circle split dramatically. Close friends, including the esteemed novelist Elizabeth Gaskell, publicly criticized him for sharing such intimate and destructive details of his private life.
The scandal led directly to the end of his relationship with his publishers, Bradbury and Evans, and the subsequent closure of his popular magazine, Household Words.
But Dickens, ever the rapid entrepreneur, immediately launched a new magazine in 1859, all the year round, placing his next novel, A Tale of Two Cities, in the first edition to ensure its commercial success.
And this novel would become one of his most popular, set in London and Paris during the French Revolution. It contains one of the most famous opening lines in literature, capturing the inherent contradictions of life. It was the best of times, it was the worst of times.
And it concludes with the ultimate noble sacrifice, the English lawyer Sidney Carton choosing to take the place of his French love rival at the guillotine, uttering the line, quote, "It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. It's a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known."
The juxtaposition is almost unbelievable. The man capable of writing this idealized, selfless, altruistic sentiment, the moral pinnacle of sacrifice, was, at that exact time, publicly destroying his wife's reputation and dividing his family for his own self.
It elevates the moral power of his fiction because we know the deeply flawed man who created it.
The psychological analysis deepened further in his next canonical novel, Great Expectations, from 1860 to 1861. Narrated by the orphan Pip, it's a brilliant exploration of snobbery, guilt, and the pursuit of false grandeur built on class.
Pip believes his sudden transformation in fortune, his great expectation, comes from the wealthy, decaying recluse Miss Havisham, who manipulates her adopted daughter Estella to break men's hearts. Pip spends years trying desperately to become a true gentleman.
But the profound revelation is that his fortune comes from the convict Abel Mag, a man from the absolute lowest rung of society whom Pip had shown kindness to years before.
Dickens is challenging the very foundation of English class status. Success isn't conferred by aristocracy, but by the tainted money of a transported criminal.
Magwitch is fatally injured trying to slip back into England, and the novel is deep in psychological insight, with Pip learning to value the man and the kindness, not the money or the status.
And as he wrote these two great novels, the pressure was clearly mounting. Dickens was starting to suffer from ill health, including painful rheumatism in the cold winters. His letters even suggested he was being afflicted by a venereal disease, which only added to the mental and physical strain.
In a highly symbolic and telling move in September 1860, perhaps trying to rid the ghosts of his past before they could become public, he burned thousands of the letters he had received over in a massive bonfire at Gad's Hill.
Without even consulting John Forster, his appointed biographer. That is the ultimate act of narrative control. He was destroying evidence to ensure that only the story he wanted told, the story of the great moral writer, survived for posterity.
But the evidence regarding the Ellen-Ternan relationship suggests it moved far beyond the public. Dickens was providing substantial financial support for Ellen and her family.
He was often crossing the English Channel to France constantly to see her, nearly 70 times between 1862 and 1865, according to our source.
Biographer Claire Tomlin argues that the relationship was constant. She suggests Dickens may have set Ellen up in Paris to hide a pregnancy.
And there is circumstantial evidence pointing to her giving birth to his son in early 1863, who then tragically died in the spring of 1865. The lengths he went to for secrecy underscore the seriousness of their bond.
Death seemed to stalk him throughout this decade. His mother and mother-in-law died within weeks of each other, and in 1864, his second son, Walter, serving with the Indian Army, also died. The emotional load was immense.
Amidst all this, he wrote his final completed novel, Our Mutual Friend, serialized between 1864 and 1860. It is a dense, powerful satire on the obsession with money and wealth in London society, particularly through the complex inheritance of John Harmon.
And of course, this was the manuscript he dramatically retrieved from the wreckage of the Staplehurst rail crash on June 95.
Despite the drama, the novel was not quite as commercially explosive as his earlier hit, but it provided enough profit and attracted enough advertisers to be a solid financial success.
In the wake of the crash, Dickens continued the relationship with Ellen Ternan, setting her up in a cottage in Slough, while he rented another nearby under the assumed name Charles Tringham.
He maintained a fragile facade of respectability while living a secretive double life.
And despite his clearly deteriorating health, suffering from gout, respiratory issues, and nerve pain, Dickens returned to the public eye with ambitious reading tours, managed by his close friend, George Dolby.
He needed the money. He had to support his numerous dependents, his elderly mother, his estranged wife, his children, and the Ternan family.
The money was staggering. He could earn up to £190 a night in London, an enormous sum in an era when most professionals earned an annual salary of perhaps £300 to £500.
He embarked on extensive tours of Britain and a grueling second American tour between 1867 and 18...
The American tour was relentless. The readings were immensely popular, attracting lines of people stretching for miles, even in the severe snowstorms of the New York winter. He was a rock star.
However, the extreme cold exacerbated his habitual colds, and the sheer volume of travel and performance was physically devastating. He and Dolby had to cut the itinerary short, canceling planned trips to Chicago and Canada.
When addressing the New York press in April 1868, he was gracious, expressing admiration for the country's transformation since his previous visit 25 years.
And the tour was a massive financial triumph, netting him £20,000. But the physical toll was irreversible. Upon returning to England, he was suffering terribly.
He was prematurely aged. Photographs from the 1860s suggested a man well into his 60s, despite being...
It was due to the years of high stress and constant output.
Nonetheless, he and Dolby planned a farewell tour of 100 readings, starting in October 1860. And this is where he introduced his most controversial and physically damaging routine, the sensation.
This was a new, dramatic routine, a performance of Nancy's brutal murder by Bill Sykes from Oliver Twist. Dickens would act out the terror, the brutality, and the desperation with such visceral intensity that audiences were often horrified. Some even fainted in their...
He reveled in the power he held over the audience, but the performance was literally killing him.
It was. The physical demand was so great that, according to medical reports and observer accounts, each performance of the Sykes and Nancy scene left him partially paralyzed for several minutes after. The intense, dramatic projection was actively breaking his central nervous system.
And the inevitable happened. On April 18, 1869, he suffered a stroke in Chester. He was paralyzed on his left side for a few minutes and struggled with coherence.
Doctors advised him immediately and gravely to cancel the rest of the tour.
Yet the commitment to his audience and the financial need was too strong. Dickens insisted on giving a final series of 12 public readings in London between January and March 70 to make up for the curtailed farewell.
He continued to perform the agonizing Sykes and Nancy scene, sometimes taking more than 10 minutes to recover from the ordeal.
He met Queen Victoria on March 9, 1870, who regretted never hearing him read from his work. His final public performance came days later, on March 15th at St. James's Hall.
He performed for an audience of 2,000 people, reading from A Christmas Carol and Pickwick Papers, ending his career on the lighthearted notes that had made him famous.
He was working feverishly on his new murder mystery, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, when his final collapse occurred. On the evening of June 8, 1870, at Gad's Hill, his sister-in-law, Georgina Hogarth, recalled him speaking incoherently as he sought to continue with his plans for dinner and a trip.
When Georgina suggested he lie down and rest, Dickens managed to respond yes, before collapsing onto the dining room floor, suffering a massive brain hemorrhage.
Charles Dickens died the following day, June 9, 1870, precisely 5 years to the day after the Staplehurst rail crash. He was only 50.
His strenuous workload, poor respiratory health, and a history of heavy alcohol intake had simply worn out his remarkable machine of a body. His final novel, Edwin Drood, was left unfinished, a tantalizing mystery for the ages.
And the scale of his legacy was immediate. Although he had intended to be buried modestly at Rochester Cathedral, a powerful editorial in the Times argued that such a national treasure belonged only.
And so Charles Dickens, the boy who endured the shame of the blacking warehouse and the debtor's prison, was buried in Westminster Abbey's Poets' Corner in a simple, quiet ceremony on June 14, 1870.
The working-class boy had achieved the status of royalty.
So we have traced this remarkable, exhaustive life, from the shame of the debtor's prison and the trauma of the blacking warehouse, through the triumph of literary celebrity and hands-on philanthropy, to the physical exhaustion that killed him prematurely.
His achievements are just timeless. He was the leading novelist of the Victorian era, leaving behind these vivid, necessary descriptions of social struggle in Master Oliver Twist, A Christmas Carol, David Copperfield, Great Expectations, and A Tale of Two.
He fundamentally changed how we view Christmas and how we understand poverty.
He really did. And crucially, he distrusted politicians and formal systems. He chose to campaign for liberal causes and social reforms not through Parliament, but through fiction.
Appealing directly to the massive heart and conscience of his readership, demonstrating a genuine desire to enact change, particularly through ventures like Urania Cottage.
But this brings us back to the central, enduring paradox of the man. This was the writer who created Sidney Carton, the epitome of noble, self-sacrificing altruism.
Yet he was also the man who callously separated from Catherine, his wife of over 2 decades and the mother of his 10 children, and publicly smeared her character in the press all while pursuing a secretive relationship with an actress less than half his age.
It is a profound, almost unbearable conflict.
It is. The tension between the moral clarity and noble sentiment of his fiction and the often base, self-serving instincts he displayed in his personal life. He was a genius at portraying the human condition, precisely because he knew both sides of that coin so well.
The Russian novelist Fyodor Dostoevsky once recalled Dickens admitting that his characters were based on 2 parts of his own personality.
Right. Dickens said that while he aspired to follow the virtuous characters, he often found himself behaving like one of his own villains.
It makes you wonder, did he write these powerful examples of moral redemption, Scrooge, Pip, Carton, because he had seen the worst of humanity, or because he was desperately seeking that redemption for himself?
He was a writer of profound moralizing fiction who struggled intensely to live up to his own standards.
So what stands out to you? Does his massive success and his proven ability to convey the struggles between noble and base instincts in the human condition, a quality that gives his novels their timeless power, does that excuse his own moral failing?
Or does knowing the complex, secretive man behind the words simply make his writings all the more potent because they come from someone who knew exactly how hard it was to choose the noble path?
It's a question that really defines his entire life.
He gave us the definitive moral blueprint for how to live, but struggled intensely to follow it himself.
That's the complex man Charles Dickens leaves us to study. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.